Section 11 of Royal Romances of Today. This is a LibriVox recording. All public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynette Calkins, Monument, Colorado. Royal Romances of Today by Kellogg Durland, Part 1, Chapter 11. The Royal Nursery of Spain. There is a striking contrast between the two princes. The Prince of Asturias is absolutely fair with flaxen hair, while Don Jaime is as dark as a typical Spaniard. Even at the age of 2, his hair is dark and his eyes are as lustrously brown as his father's. All three of the children are learning to speak English, Spanish, and French with equal fluency. They have between them 2 English nursery governesses and 1 French maid, in addition to a usual number of Spanish maids and other servants. Their mother, the Queen, was brought up familiar with French and German, in addition to her own English, while King Alfonso was taught English, French, and German from his boyhood. It is expected that a modern king be able to talk and think in 2 or 3 languages, but it is exceptional to find a crown prince of 3 who can already express himself in 3 tongues. When speaking to his mother, the Queen, the little prince invariably uses English, but with his father, the king, he uses Spanish. He seems to know instinctively one tongue from the other. If he is handed something, for example a box, he will take it and pronounce the word in English and Spanish, and sometimes in French also. In that way he seems to instinctively teach himself the 3 languages simultaneously. The 2 princes are naturally constant playmates. In the Casa de Campo, where they are taken every morning at 10:30, they play in the sand together and stand up their little toy soldiers. As I had the privilege of playing here with them one morning, I shall have more to say of this later. The Crown Prince usually refers to his brother as "my brother the Infante," never as Don Jaime or Jaime, although occasionally he lapses into English and calls him Jimmy. The princes are very fond of each other, but like all children they have their quarrels now and then. The Crown Prince has a good deal of a will of his own, and sometimes his nurses find him something more than a handful. One morning he rushed up to the royal governess and said, "My brother the Infante has been very naughty, so I kicked him and he cried. But now he is no longer naughty, so I shall run and kiss him." Whereupon he rushed off to the playroom in the chalet, where he found Don Jaime and tenderly kissed him. Don Jaime has one of the sweetest baby faces I have ever seen. He has inherited his father's soft, beautiful eyes and winning smile. His nature is said to be as lovely as his smile. He is a great favorite in the royal household, and already is manifesting unusual signs of keenness and intelligence. Curiously enough, the newspapers of Europe, including England, and also of America, have from time to time printed stories to the effect that these 2 princes are deaf and dumb and otherwise defective. These rumors are all baseless slanders. The king's secretary has been put to great trouble writing to inform people all over the world that there is no truth in these stories. On one occasion, the Prime Minister found it necessary to issue a public signed statement to the effect that he had personally talked with the princes and that he knew them to be mentally and physically fit and normal. As a matter of fact, I found them both unusually sturdy boys with exceptional intelligence for their years. In this connection, I had a striking experience of the way these stories are circulated. The 2nd or 3rd day after I arrived in Madrid, the head porter at my hotel said to me, "So, you are the American physician?" "What American physician?" I asked in surprise. "The doctor who has been brought from New York to attend the Crown Prince." "No," I replied, "I am not a doctor. How did you come to think that I was?" He thereupon explained that shortly after my arrival in Madrid, the king's private secretary had called for me at my hotel, and that directly after I had been seen entering the royal palace. This aroused some curiosity among the hotel people, and finally someone concluded that as I wore a Van Dyke beard, I must be a physician, and as I had gone to the palace, I had undoubtedly gone to examine the princes, who were said to be deaf and dumb. This absurd tale circulated about the capital, and as it went from mouth to mouth, details were added, and that which at first was characterized as probable and circumstantial became absolutely definite. It is really cruel to spread such nonsensical stories about two such bright boys as the Prince of Asturias and Don Jaime. Both the Prince of Asturias and Don Jaime are devoted to horses and all the trappings of the stables. They are also very fond of cats. There is one big nursery cat which is an especial favorite. So far, they have not taken much interest in dogs, and in fact, there isn't even one dog about the royal palace in Madrid. Formerly, the king had many dogs, but now very few, and these are kept in the country. The queen had a dog which was presented to her by her uncle, the late King Edward of England, but one day at La Granja the dog strayed away, as the best of dogs sometimes will, even when their masters are sovereigns and their abode a royal palace. The palace of the Alcazar in Seville is a favorite residence with the princess, just as it is with the queen. The gardens of this old Moorish palace are very delightful, and here the royal children love to play, just as their father did when he was a boy. Down one of the walks is a series of tiny holes. Ordinarily, no one would even see them. It was a favorite prank of the little Don Alfonso to send some unsuspecting person along this walk while he loitered in the rear. Suddenly, he would turn a hidden wheel, and instantly a fine stream of water would shoot up through each of these squirt holes to the astonishment and oftentimes consternation of the victim of the royal joke. There is a maze of boxwood in these gardens which affords the children endless amusement. A stranger once entering this maze gets completely entangled and bewildered. It takes even an adult some time to discover the path leading out. Here, too, are several small ponds stocked with goldfish, and every day the princes visit the ponds to feed the fish. The Prince of Asturias is especially fond of playing in sand, and on his 3rd birthday the queen bought for him a set of sand pails and little shovels, which pleased him tremendously. One day I was in the nursery playroom at the Alcazar, and I took occasion to examine the toys of the royal children. What was my surprise to find a great assortment of little tin mechanical toys, such as one sees exhibited all along 14th Street or 23rd Street, toys that cost about 10 cents each, the things that are wound up with a key and then rush about in circles. There were boxing men and little go-karts drawn by monkeys and donkeys, and a great assortment of similar devices. Of course, they had many grand toys, gifts from sovereigns, potentates, and ambassadors. But so far neither of the princes has exhibited any particular predilection for these expensive toys. The simple 10-cent things afford them as much pleasure as anything. The favorite toy of the crown prince for a long time was a doll dressed as a soldier. The one positive passion that this little fellow has as yet revealed is soldiering. To most children, soldiering is the most fascinating thing in the world, but to the Prince of Asturias, soldiers are almost an obsession. The sound of bugles and drums excites him tremendously, and he never wearies of watching troops at drill or on parade. The guard mount at the royal palace in Madrid takes place every morning at 11 o'clock, and is considerable of a ceremony, many troops being employed and representing several branches of the army, infantry, cavalry, and field artillery, while 2 bands are constantly playing. The prince's room in the palace looks out upon the esplanade where this takes place, and never a day does he fail to watch this when he is in the palace. This is another trait inherited from his father. Another remarkable evidence of more than ordinary brightness in the Prince of Asturias is his familiarity with the different uniforms. He knows them all, and rarely makes an error. Even from his window looking down into the street, he can distinguish an artillery uniform from the infantry, a lancer from a halberdier. Queen Victoria Eugenie is one of the most devoted of mothers. As it has been the policy in Spain for Queen's consort to hold aloof from politics, she has been able to devote more of her time than would ordinarily be the case to her children, without at the same time neglecting other duties of queenship. She is devoted to each of them alike, with a possible special fondness for the Infanta Beatrice. But the Infanta is only 1 year old, and as she is the baby as well as the one daughter, this slight preference is understandable. The princes get up every morning at 7:30. After their bath, they repair at once to the Queen's room and remain for an hour or more. Thus is every day started. Every bright morning, when the royal family is in residence at Madrid, all 3 children are taken to the Casa de Campo to play at 10:30. When they tire of their play, they drive a little, and the Prince of Asturias takes his morning ride on his pony, Balai, and then they go to the pretty little chalet which has been built for them in the park, and enjoy a nap before luncheon. The prince is keen to hear stories, especially stories about soldiers. They must be invented stories, however, and each morning the governess or one of the nurses is implored to tell a story. Generally, he drops off to sleep before the story is finished, which is what he likes. At bedtime, the Queen generally tells him a story until he falls asleep. One Monday morning, in one of the rooms of the private apartments in the royal palace at Madrid, I noticed a suspended sheet. There were a group of chairs in front, and obviously the sheet had been used as a screen for lantern pictures. Upon inquiry, I was told that every Sunday evening the king and queen and all the royal family dine together informally, en famille, as it were, and after the meal they all adjourn to the adjoining room for a biograph exhibition. These Sunday evening suppers and entertainments constitute one of the most charming features of the Spanish court life. The children of the Spanish royal family are especially fortunate in having parents who are above all things human, vibrant with youth, indulgent with the pranks and pleasantries of childhood. It is not so long since King Alfonso himself was a mischievous lad, and Queen Victoria Eugenie a capricious girl. According to all reports, the boy Alfonso was quite as full of spirit and mischief as the average small boy anywhere in the world. King Alfonso even now has not outgrown this love for fun. The first Shrove Tuesday that Queen Victoria was in Spain, she was made the victim of a joke by her royal spouse and his sister, the Infanta Maria Teresa. As Her Majesty was passing through one of the corridors of the palace, the king and the Infanta suddenly sprang out upon her, disguised behind masks, giving her a considerable start. This is the survival of an ancient custom in Spain peculiar to this particular day. This boyishness is constantly cropping out, often to the amusement of the court. There can be no doubt that when the little princes are old enough to indulge in practical jokes, that they will find their royal father and mother the most sympathetic of parents. I had seen the royal children a good many times during my stay in Spain, but I had no opportunity for close observation of them. I wanted to see them at play, and to take some snapshots of them with my own camera. None of my friends at court quite knew how to obtain this privilege for me. The request was without precedent, as the princes have not yet reached the age of holding audiences. So I spoke to His Majesty the King about it. I broached the matter delicately, but without the slightest hesitation the King replied, "Most certainly you may meet them. In the palace if you like. But they are so little I am afraid that they would be shy and quiet. The best thing would be for you to go to the Casa de Campo one morning and play with them. There you may also have your camera and take as many snapshots as you like. And if the pictures are good," he continued, "you will let me show them to Her Majesty the Queen, who is always much interested in all photographs of the princes." End of chapter 11. Section 12 of Royal Romances of Today. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynette Calkins, Monument, Colorado. Royal Romances of Today by Kellogg Durland. Part 1, Chapter 12. The Princes at Play. I thanked His Majesty warmly for this unusual courtesy, and the second morning after, Señor de Torres called for me at my hotel just before 10 o'clock, and we drove together to the reserve in the Casa de Campo. The Marquesa de Salamanca, who is the first royal governess, passed us in an automobile near the entrance. The Marquesa de Puerta, who is the second governess, was not there that morning. We arrived a brief moment behind the nursery. The princes and their nursemaids were still in the mule coach driven by Corral, the favorite nursery coachman. Behind was the little open carriage drawn by the 2 donkeys, Sol and Luna, and the tiny Shetland pony, Balai, of the Crown Prince. Behind was the little open carriage drawn by the 2 donkeys, Sol and Luna, and the tiny Shetland pony, Balai, of the Crown Prince. As we approached, the Marquesa de Salamanca lifted the Prince of Asturias from the carriage and brought him in her arms toward us, presenting him as the little Crown Prince. Anticipating her, however, the little fellow cried out, "Kellogg! Kellogg is coming!" Now, Kellogg is a Madrid photographer who takes most of the photographs of the royal family, and the prince had noticed the cameras in my hand. The Marquesa told him, as she put him down at our feet, that I was not Kellogg, though I had cameras and could take his picture. He surveyed me critically for a moment, and then came and posed himself before me with his little right hand at salute, asking that I first take him that way. He wore the same broad-brimmed white straw hat encircled by a pale blue ribbon and the cunning little white flannel suit in which I had first seen him going out to drive. He tried valiantly to wrestle with my name, but this proved too much of a mouthful. The 2 English governesses and the French maid gathered the children's toys from the coach, and we started for a stream of water where the children wanted to play. As we started, the Infante Don Jaime was brought over. He is a dear boy with a wonderfully sweet and friendly smile. It was evident from the first moment that he, at least, had no intention of standing on ceremony. The wee Infanta Beatrice was too sleepy to pay much attention, so she was put to rest in an ordinary baby carriage and was soon trundled fast to sleep. The Prince of Asturias first took up the sand pail and shovel that had recently been given him by his mother, the Queen, for his 3rd birthday. Don Jaime, however, found more interest in the water. He splashed the stream for a few minutes, then toddled off to a spring and began tossing stones into the water, laughing with delight at each splash. When he had used all of his stones, he asked me to recover them. This was a task, but I rolled up my sleeves, and getting down on my knees, I began to pick them from the bottom, one by one, and arrange them around the spring wall. Just as I finished, the Prince of Asturias ran up, and seizing the largest stone of all, splashed it violently back into the water, wetting me from head to foot. This gave them both great pleasure, and they laughed tremendously. "See," exclaimed the Infante, "I have given you a bath." The next moment the prince decided that my dress was incomplete, as I had no flower in my buttonhole. He asked me if I wouldn't like him to get me a nice flower. I told His Royal Highness that I should be very pleased. So away he went to the flower beds. He was critical in his selection. A number of flowers were successively rejected. Finally, he plucked a beautiful white rose, and bringing it back, placed it, with a little assistance, in my buttonhole. Don Jaime, in the meantime, watched his brother with evident interest and decided that it was his turn to do something toward entertaining me. So he went off to the strawberry bed and picked some luscious ripe berries to feed me. The morning was unusually dark and gloomy for Madrid in June, and I am very much of an amateur at photography, consequently dependent upon bright light. About 11 o'clock the clouds lightened somewhat, and I got out my cameras. Instantly both princes were interested. The Prince of Asturias particularly seemed to enjoy having his picture taken. I snapped him repeatedly, and found that he never seemed to weary of posing for me. The Infanta Beatrice had now waked up, so she joined us. Corral, ever attentive and watchful, took great delight in catching the eye of the small princess so that her face should be turned toward the camera. She showed a silent interest in the performance, but her little eyes were still heavy with sleep, and it was evident that she would much have preferred to remain in her perambulator. She grew alert, however, when the donkey carriage was brought round. She enjoys her rides about the gardens, sitting by the side of her brother Don Jaime. Don Jaime climbed into the carriage by himself and picked up the whip. The Infanta thought that she should hold this, and straightway reached out her hand to grasp it. The two wrestled back and forth until between them they dropped it onto the ground. Then there was storm and tears. When I looked round, the prince was proudly seated on Belaye. Belaye is one of the smallest of Shetland ponies, and his saddle precisely like a toy. It is not quite a real saddle, for it has a seat and straps to secure the little rider. But these are the first lessons of the prince in riding. By the time he is 6, he will doubtless mount a real saddle and ride just like a little man. Besides his Shetland pony, he has 2 little donkeys, so tiny that any man could carry one under each arm. These are harnessed to a little cart, and the young prince takes his first lessons in driving in the beautiful and extensive park behind the royal palace, known as the Casa de Campo. Formerly he had a 3rd donkey called Astra, but Astra died. Some time after this distressing event, the prince was asked about Astra by someone in the palace, and he made answer with a certain manner of mystery. "Oh, he has gone away. He is in the Casa de Campo eating strawberries." In amusing contrast to these dwarf donkeys are 4 sturdy mules, which are attached to the big nursery coach in which ride not only the Prince of Asturias, but also his brother Don Jaime, his sister Infanta Beatrice, and 2 of their nurses. Beside the carriage ride 2 splendidly mounted equerries, and behind 2 royal grooms. On the whole, it is an imposing cavalcade, this nursery out a-airing. The 2 princes, aged 3 and 2 respectively, sit on the main seat. A brace for their feet has been adjusted to the carriage, and 2 leather belts keep them securely in place. One day I was going into the palace just as the nursery was about to start out. The little prince and the Infante were in their seats, and the baby Infanta was just being brought downstairs. As I passed the carriage, I raised my hat to the wee boys, both of whom were dressed in white with broad-brimmed straw hats. Instantly 2 little hands were raised to their right temples, elbows out, eyes front, all with military precision. No soldier could have given a truer salute. It was so charming, so unexpected, that I laughed outright. On later days, when I saw them out driving, I noticed that each time they passed a flag, they saluted it, and each time an officer or soldier saluted them, the salute was returned. The morning wore on till noontime, when Don Jaime grew overpoweringly sleepy, and the prince grew anxious for his morning story, preliminary to his noon nap. We drove and rode and picked more flowers and threw more stones into the water and made more sand piles, and we were all very happy. I found them wholesome, hardy children, normal in all respects, bright beyond their years, and well developed. How the baseless stories concerning their supposed infirmities and defectiveness ever started is a mystery to me, unless political enemies of the monarchical parties set them in circulation with malice aforethought. After my morning with them in the Casa de Campo, some people at my hotel said to me, "What a pity that the princes are not right in their faculties." "But they are perfectly right," I replied indulgently. "Those stories are pure nonsense." "Oh, no, sir, you must be mistaken." "How can I be mistaken?" I answered. "I have just spent a morning with them, and I found them not only normal in every way, but particularly intelligent." "That cannot be," was the reply, "because it is said they are defective." I began to grow indignant, and finally I gave up the controversy. After I had gone, they asked one another, as I later learned, how much the king had paid me to say that the princes were all right. What is one to do with such people? And this is characteristic of what is met often in Madrid. The Prince of Asturias is today one of the loveliest of children. Presently he must submit to the discipline which will make of him a strong, fearless man fit to lead and rule a nation. If he lives, he will succeed to the throne of Spain as King Alfonso XIV. There is no better wish that I may express for my readers than that when they come to this beautiful summer land of Spain, they may have something of the same privileges I have enjoyed, that they may meet this manly, courageous, wise King, Alfred XIII, face to face, clasp his hand in hearty grasp, and sit with him in his study by the hour, listening to his clear-cut, incisive conversation, enjoying his ideas and ideals, all expressed in most excellent English. Or go with him to the beautiful polo ground and watch him play the fastest sort of game, riding his beautiful ponies brought over from the Argentine Republic, that they may meet the beautiful Queen Victoria Eugenie, the English princess who is the true heroine of this romance, and perhaps hear from her own lips the story of the beautiful prophecy of her father, now long dead, that one day she should come to Spain and be very, very happy. Perchance, indeed, some favored ones may be shown the Spanish fan he sent her from Seville, and which is today her most treasured possession. Above all, I would wish that all might spend a morning such as I spent in the Casa de Campo with the little princes, playing in the sand, splashing water and eating strawberries plucked by these dear little royal hands, and carry away a pure white rose, selected and plucked by him who will one day, God willing, be King Alfonso XIV of Spain. End of Section 12. End of Part 1. Queen Victoria Eugenie of Spain.
Section 13 of Royal Romances of Today. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Royal Romances of Today by Kellogg Durland. Part 2. Empress Alexandra Fedorovna. Chapter 1. Sunny. The most beautiful queen on any throne, she was called when first she became Empress of all the Russians. She still is tall and stately. Her hair is luxuriant and rich in color. Eyes that some call blue and some call gray look out through long dark lashes, and in them lies a great sadness, an appealing wistfulness touched with regret, a silent melancholy betraying soul tragedy. Yet as a child she was known as Sunny. The life story of Sunny has never before been comprehensively told in English. This is curious because there probably is not a person in the whole world who would not like to hear the wonderful romance of how a poor little German princess became a great sovereign, the co-ruler of one of the vastest empires on earth, the mistress of a fabulously rich and bewildering extravagant court, with opportunity for becoming the most powerful woman in Europe. Sunny was the childhood nickname of this little princess, and after the hardships and vicissitudes of a quiet girlhood, where there was a constant struggle to maintain appearances, she was courted by a wayward gallant who was heir to a mighty crown. Sunny lost her heart to the royal wooer, and he, putting aside the less noble loves of his reckless, youthful days, pledged himself to her, persistently courted her against wide opposition, turned a deaf ear to the counsels of emperors and queens who tried to discourage the match, and after years of battling with diplomatic intrigue and personal restraint, he carried his purpose, married the German princess who was truly the bride of his heart, and in marrying her raised her from the obscurity and poverty of her own simple home to the exalted rank of empress. This is the true story of Princess Alex of Hesse, whom Nicholas II made Tsaritsa of Russia. There is something tremendously dramatic about this little German princess stepping out of the quiet of her Darmstadt home in the arena of world affairs, and taking her position as empress over 140 millions of people. Yet of her life almost nothing is known by the world at large. No woman of modern times has had such marvelous opportunities for the exercise of personal influence and power. Yet who knows her? I had seen her in St. Petersburg. I knew men and women of the court who had told me things about her from time to time, but I felt less acquainted with her life than that of any sovereign in Europe. I turned to the magazine and newspaper files of the last 15 years, and I was amazed at the meagerness of information concerning her. I made diligent inquiry among people who frequently are veritable mines of gossip and stories concerning royal personages, But scarcely a thing could I gather concerning the Tsaritsa, who in many ways occupies the most unique position of any woman in the world. When I set forth in all seriousness to learn of her from her childhood to the present time, to gather the details of her charming romance, and the story how she became the wife of an emperor, I found I must go far afield, overseas to Germany, to Russia. I must seek my information from her courtiers, her ladies-in-waiting, her friends, princes and princesses of the realm, tutors of her children, servants in her palaces, officials of the imperial household. So I went. I taught with all these people, and many more besides, and the story I set down here is the story of her life, as I have heard it piecemeal from the lips of those who have been closest to her during the years that she has occupied a position of world eminence. The Tsaritsa is now 39 years old. She was born at Darmstadt, Germany, June 6, 1872, and christened Princess Alix Victoria Helene Louise Beatrix. She was the youngest daughter of the Grand Duke and Duchess of Hesse and the Rhine. Her mother was Princess Alice of England, daughter of Queen Victoria. Her sister, Princess Victoria, became the wife of Louis of Battenberg. Her sister Elizabeth became the wife of the Grand Duke Sergius of Russia, uncle of the present Tsar, while a third sister became Princess Henry of Prussia. Prince Henry is the brother of Emperor William of Germany, and he is the official head of the German Navy. The only living brother of these remarkable sisters eventually came into the title of Grand Duke of Hesse and the Rhine, which he holds today. Besides all these close connections with important royalties, she was a niece of King Edward of England and cousin to innumerable lesser royalties. After her marriage, she became connected with the courts of Denmark and Greece. The Dukes of Hesse were made Grand Dukes during the time of the Napoleonic Wars, and Grand Dukes they have remained to this day. Thus Princess Alix has always had grand connections, but the Duchy of Hesse and the Rhine was poor, and as the Grand Duke, her father, was not even ruler of the duchy, and possessed of only small financial resources, the family household was forced to accept a comparatively frugal regime. There are hundreds of girls in America today who have never felt the press of poverty as did Princess Alix through the early years of her life. The little princess was taught to sew and to assist in home duties, not only because this was all part of the proper training of a princess, but because of necessity. The simplicity of this home was like the simplicity of an ordinary German or English middle-class home of today. In her letters to Queen Victoria, the mother of Princess Alix was wont to speak very freely of the straitened circumstances of the family. Some of the items and incidents mentioned in these letters can hardly be credited. For instance, in one letter the death of a cow is lamented, because it will be so difficult to get another. In another she sends thanks for some furniture. In another the summer holiday is discussed and frank acknowledgment made that they cannot afford to go to Scheveningen, the charming and fashionable Dutch watering resort a few miles from The Hague, because it is too costly, but they must be content with Blankenberg, which is treeless, dull, and uninteresting, but more reasonable of price. Princess Alix's allowance of pocket money was 25 cents a week up to the time of her confirmation, when she received double that amount. Alix was the youngest born of the Grand Duke and Duchess, and was called Alix because Queen Victoria had always been annoyed at the way Germans pronounced Alice, and so at her suggestion Alice was changed to Alix to simplify for the people of her own country. Alecky she was frequently called by her mother, but the neighbors and friends of the family early came to call her the little Princess Sonnenschein, and from this came the name of endearment which she carried for so long, Sunny. Baby is a sweet, merry little person like Ella, her sister, but her features are smaller, her mother once wrote to Queen Victoria, and her eyes are darker, and she has very long lashes and auburn hair. She is always laughing and with a deep dimple in one cheek, just like Ernie. Ernie was her brother, who is now Grand Duke of Hesse and the Rhine. On another occasion her mother wrote, "She is indeed the personification of her nickname, Sonny." During all this time Empress' dreams were far off, and the big world with its infinite possibilities, its large joys and burden of days, but visions of twilight hours. When she was only 6 years old, her mother died. This was the first deep shadow of her life, and from that time on she carried little responsibilities that tended to weigh upon her, to drive her more and more into herself, and perhaps to plant the seeds of moroseness, which some say is now a quality of her character. At 12, the true romance of her life came to her. Princess Elizabeth, the older sister of Alex, had been courted by Grand Duke Sergius of Russia, an uncle of the present Tsar and brother of the then reigning emperor. In 1884, Sergius came to Darmstadt for his bride, and young Nicholas was of the royal party. Nicholas here met Princess Alex for the first time, and in her saw his future bride, the future empress of his country. Nicholas, though nearly 4 years older than she, was only 16, but sometimes hearts can choose their own at 16 as surely as in later years, and if love has since been the dominant element in the family life of this royal couple, it entered in there in Darmstadt at this early time. End of section 13. Section 14 of Royal Romances of Today. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Royal Romances of Today by Kellogg Durland. Part 2, Chapter 2. Courtship and a Journey to the Northland. From the hour of their first meeting, Princess Alex never doubted the love of her young Russian scion, whose still boyish heart she knew she had reached. Child as she was, Princess Alex already felt germinating within her beginnings of woman love, and from that time through all the following girlhood days, through her period of lovely maidenhood, she held in close memory the picture of her first wooer. That her young lover was less faithful was not so much a matter of surprise, because, first of all, being a man, and especially a Russian man, not to include a prince besides, Nicholas naturally went the way of all the rest, the way of so many men, of most Russians, and of all princes, and under the tutelage of his relatives, the Grand Dukes, and other unavoidable corrupt associates of the court, he sowed his wild oats as part of the day's work, and as a matter of course sowed them furiously and very, very wildly. Nicholas's mother, spouse of the Emperor Alexander III, herself early suggested that a mistress for the young Nicholas might be well as a choice of evils, the lesser one. Thereupon Nicholas was taken to the Imperial Ballet, there to make his choice of a temporary love. The woman whom he chose at that time lives today in St. Petersburg, in a grand palace given her by the little man who now rules the mighty Empire of Russia, built by money exacted from thousands of starving peasants throughout the length and breadth of the vast empire. Perhaps for a time Nicholas forgot the little German girl, but she never forgot her prince. Perhaps Nicholas was lacking in that blessed quality we call loyalty, or it may be that he was only weak of character, as most of his friends of the time would have us believe. At all events, he was not even true to his Polish dancer, and when he became infatuated with a Jewess, his imperial father cried enough, and sent his son on a tour around the world. Nicholas was accompanied on this trip by another bon vivant, his cousin Prince George of Greece. Prince George, however, was also an athlete and a man of ready wit, and when in Japan a fanatic rushed upon the Tsarevich to kill him, Prince George raised his arm and succeeded in so diverting the stroke that Nicholas received only a glancing blow on the forehead. Thus was he spared to return to Darmstadt and renew his suit for his love of earlier days. Royal marriages are so rarely love matches that the world watches the few that are with admiration and hope. Too often diplomatic objections prevent the coming together of royal lovers, And so in the case of Nicholas, his father desired the union of his son with a Montenegrin princess. Queen Victoria never really opposed the match, but she feared for the safety of her granddaughter. The Russian throne is supposed to offer unparalleled peril to its occupants, and the health of the Princess Alex had never been rugged. Queen Victoria feared that under the great stress and strain of St. Petersburg, Princess Alex would not have the strength to bear up. The Empress Frederick of Germany, an aunt of Princess Alex, was also doubtful of the wisdom of the match. Her reasons, however, were somewhat different. Empress Frederick had had many opportunities to watch the development of her sister's daughter, and she had noticed, perchance with pain, certain qualities of temperament which may have been the result of her trying circumstances in early years, together with the fact that she had been left so much alone through the early death of her mother. She was reserved and shy, therefore seeming cold of nature and haughty of manner. Having seen far less of the great world than most royal princesses, she shrank from the social whirl. The loneliness of her childhood had taught her to find resource within herself. Thus habits of reading, study, and contemplation had become part of her nature. These characteristics all make for the development of a splendid, substantial woman, but they fail to bring out the qualities essential to a woman who is to preside over a brilliant court, where the sway of personality, of grace, charm, and wit, all the surface virtues, count for as much, if not more, than the deeper qualities of sound character and a disciplined mind. Appreciating all this, Empress Frederick did not encourage, even if she refrained from actively opposing the marriage. The Polish princess, Catherine Radziwiłł, chanced to be passing through Germany about this time, and lingered for a few days, the guest of the Empress Frederick. One afternoon, Princess Radziwiłł referred to the betrothal and remarked on the happy fate which had led Nicholas to select a bride who had been imbued with the ideas of Germany and England. To her surprise, the Empress gravely shook her head and remarked that it was not always safe to trust what was said by people ignorant of the true character of those they praised or blamed, according to the exigencies of the moment. When Princess Radziwiłł pressed the Empress further, she added that Princess Alex had a haughty disposition, and would be inclined to take more seriously than might be supposed her position of absolute sovereign. She went so far as to refer to the despotic temperament of her niece and her self-opinion tendencies. "She is far too much convinced of her own perfection," said the Empress, "and she will never listen to other people's advice. Besides, she has no tact, and perhaps without knowing it, will manage to wound the feelings of the persons she ought to try and conciliate." Princess Radziwiłł remarked that it was passing strange a daughter of Princess Alice and a granddaughter of Queen Victoria could have such a disposition, whereupon the Empress returned sadly, "Oh, but when do you see daughters taking after their mothers?" Then, after a short pause, she continued, "It would not be possible for anyone to be like my sister." But Alex loved Nicholas, and she would be daunted by neither the perils of a restless empire, nor the fear of physical weakness or suffering, nor the discouragements of her royal relatives. And Nicholas, with that stubbornness that has ever characterized him, set about to win over all opponents to their marriage. First he appealed to his uncle, Grand Duke Sergei, who had married Alex's sister Elizabeth. Then he went to London and pleaded with Queen Victoria. Finally he gained the consent of his own father, who was the last to yield. Then Nicholas himself went to Darmstadt to carry the news in person to his princess, who had now waited for this message for 9 long years. There still remained one important obstacle, and that this was a difficulty to the German princess is to her everlasting credit. According to the laws of Russia, the throne may never be occupied or shared by anyone not of the Greek Catholic faith. Now, Princess Alex, being born in Germany and brought up in Germany, was a Protestant. From earliest childhood she had been devoted to the Church and to her religion, and the tenets of the Greek Church were totally unfamiliar to her. When they were presented to her, there were many things that seemed so strange that for a long time she could not acknowledge her acceptance of them. In most royal marriages, the brides changed their faith as lightly as they changed their gowns, and learned the priest-taught formulas that their tutors prescribed, and subscribed to the doctrines of their adopted church without fear or question. Alex demanded intimate knowledge of all the doctrines she must accept, so learned theologians and doctrinaires were dispatched to Darmstadt to give her instruction. Many are the stories told of her long arguments with these learned men over points that were not clear to her, and of her deep prying questions into the reasons for certain regulations and laws. At one time it seemed as if she could not accept certain things that these holy men were endeavoring to press upon her, and more than one rumor went abroad that the royal marriage would never take place simply because of these religious difficulties. There seemed some ground for these reports, for the priest who had been her especial instructor, one Yanishev, at one point became so despairing of his heretical charge that he left Darmstadt altogether and returned to Russia. A long letter from the princess was received by Nicholas, and he, instead of being hurt by the way she held out on these matters, expressed himself as highly pleased. A vigorous correspondence then passed quickly between them, and in the end it was her love that conquered. I do not think that Princess Alex has ever been what the world calls an ambitious woman. No one believes that the Greek priest converted her, but she loved Nicholas with a love that transcended all creeds and dogmas, and finally, after long hesitation, her love rose to the highest point, and for his sake she accepted the state church of the land that was to be her future home. At the time the betrothal was definitely announced, it was anticipated that Alexander would probably continue to reign for some years, and that in the meantime the bride of the heir apparent would have ample time to accustom herself to Russia, and to school herself for the difficult role of Empress, which she would one day have to assume. The Russian press was flooded with stories and anecdotes of the beauty, the cleverness, and the varied accomplishments of the German princess whom Nicholas was bringing to Russia. This was to popularize her among the people. It was said that she was a rare musician, a great scholar, and even that she had taken the degree of Doctor of Philosophy at some university. Flaming lithographs of her were circulated by the thousand among the peasants, and in the space of a few months her name had become a household word across the empire, and the Russian people were prepared to accept her as a worthy consort to the heir apparent. The betrothal was announced in April. In September of the same year, Tsar Alexander's health began to fail rapidly, and he was removed from the cold of the northern capital to the royal estate of Livadia in the Crimea. I have seen royal palaces and parks in every part of the world, but I have never seen a more beautiful place than Livadia. It is on the slope of the Crimean Alps, some of whose peaks tower more than 3,000 feet above the glorious blue waters of the Black Sea that here lap the shores of Livadia. Yalta, lovely Yalta, a winter jewel daintily set in a wondrous setting of sea and hills, is removed from Livadia by only a spur of mountains easily and quickly crossed, and here, when all the rest of Russia lies frozen beneath semi-Arctic snows, roses and oleanders bloom, and ripe fruit hangs luscious for the pickers. Here winter suns are warm and winter evenings balmy. I think the fairest nights I have ever seen have been in Yalta and on the road to Livadia, when a December moon shone brightly over the restless water, and aslant the lovely hills as in dream nights of June. To this most beauteous spot in all Russia, Alexander III was taken. Was the monarch's last journey. When it became evident that the end was near, Nicholas sent for his bride-to-be. Probably no woman or man in modern times has had so warm a welcome prepared. The press of Europe was echoing and re-echoing the praise of the young princess, in happy attune with the inspired press of Russia. The Emperor William himself went to meet the princess at the Berlin railroad station and bid her Godspeed, she who was to wear an imperial crown. Warsaw was the first Russian city where Princess Alex paused on her journey to Livadia, whither she was hastening in the expectancy of marrying prior to the death of Alexander III. At Warsaw she was met by her sister, the Grand Duchess Elizabeth, and farther along the journey by the heir apparent. Her progress across the empire was like a triumphal march, despite the sadness that hovered over a nation whose ruler lay dying. Great arches of welcome were raised to her, and the populace turned out all along the way to do her honor. We can well imagine the mingled feelings of surprise and awe which must have overwhelmed the retiring and somewhat austere German princess, as she came in contact now for the first time with the great world, and with the homage of a vast people which from that day was to be hers for all the rest of the days of her life. Princes and potentates, like peasants from the isolated villages of the steppes, bent their knees in humble obeisance, while soldiers stood at salute as she passed. She knew full well that she was leaving behind her forever the simple life she had always known up until now. She knew that she was going to a deathbed scene between ranks of gold and silver. Though her path was scattered with flowers, and the plaudits of the people continuously rang in her ears, she knew what the end of the journey must be, and she must have known, too, in a dim, tragic way, all that lay beyond the endraped gold, toward which she was speeding in the Crimea. End of section 14. Section 15 of Royal Romances of Today. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Royal Romances of Today by Kellogg Durland. Part 2, Chapter 3. Assuming the Burden. Upon arriving at Livadia, Princess Alex hastened to the bedside of the moribund emperor. The following day, in the royal chapel of Livadia, she was received into the Greek Orthodox Church under the name of Alexandra Feodorovna. Her own preference was for the name Catherine, but, yielding to the wishes of Nicholas, she accepted the name of his choosing. The wedding date was fixed for the following Wednesday, but the nearing end of Alexander necessitated a brief postponement. Only till the end had come, and all that remained of him had been transported to St. Petersburg and laid to rest beside the remains of his father, and his father's fathers, for many generations, in the gold-inspired chapel of the grim fortress of Saints Peter and Paul, on the banks of the swift-flowing river Neva. Some there are, believers in omens, who attribute many of the difficulties of her life as Tsaritsa to the name she took when she was received into the Russian Church, Alexandra Feodorovna, after the grandmother of the Tsar, her husband. For Alexandra had long been an ill-fated name in the unhappy land of Prince Alex's adoption. A daughter of the Emperor Paul, who was called Alexandra, had a very tragic end. When she was but 17 years of age, her grandmother, Catherine II, arranged that she should marry the King of Sweden. The preparations for this royal wedding were all elaborately made, and on the day set all was well, so far as the world knew. The tables were laid for the marriage banquet, and the bride, all robed and ready, awaited her royal bridegroom. The guests were assembled, and the priests stood by in their gorgeous mantles of gold. Suddenly His Majesty the King announced that he would not go on with the wedding. His courtiers and suite pleaded and implored him not to offer so terrible an insult to the daughter of an emperor and to the whole Russian nation. But in vain. The king was obdurate. The news was tardily announced to Catherine, whose wrath knew no bounds. The guests withdrew, and the Swedish party quit the Winter Palace and returned to Stockholm. The humiliated Alexandra was given no further choice even after this terrible ordeal, but was speedily married willy-nilly to an Austrian Grand Duke. But she really did not survive the shock of the failure of her marriage with the King of Sweden, and she died of humiliation and a broken heart, only 19 years of age. A daughter of Nicholas I was named Alexandra. She was early married to a stepson of Napoleon Bonaparte, but a fatal disease carried her off before she was 20, again emphasizing the traditional tragedy associated with his name. Alexander II had a daughter, Alexandra, a lovely golden-haired child, but she succumbed to an illness in childhood. No wonder, then, that the superstitious feared for the future of Princess Alex when she took for herself the name that has so often been borne by daughters of sorrow in Russia. But Alexandra was the name Nicholas chose for her, and that sufficed. The mourning family returned to St. Petersburg after the death of Alexander III, and as soon as preparations could be made, the wedding took place, the entire court laying aside its mourning weeds for one day. Thus, edged in black, the official ceremonial life of the Tsaritsa began. At the wedding ceremony she did not show to advantage. She was reserved in her manner to the point of severity, and a trait was noticed on that day that has militated against her ever since. Despite her natural physical grace, she does not know how to dress. Her simple German training had not taught her how to wear beautiful clothes. Possibly the wearing of lovely gowns well is an instinct born in some women. At all events, on her wedding day, the Empress bride failed to please the court. A few days later, when the young Tsar was receiving deputations from different parts of the empire, there occurred a rupture between him and some deputies from the province of Tver, which he has never been able to outlive, and for some unexplained reason the sentiments that he then expressed in heat were accepted as the sentiments of the Empress as well. The chairman of the deputation humbly offered the congratulations of the people of Tver, and ventured to add that it was their hope that the new emperor might be pleased, in the course of his reign, to grant certain liberties to his people, perhaps even a constitution. This hope was partly based on their faith in the young empress, whom they expected would have liberal sympathies as a result of her life in Germany and her affiliations with England. But the Tsar burst forth into a terrible tirade against such notions, told them to be done with these idle dreams, and even threatened the whole deputation with banishment. The whole country was astounded at this uncalled-for outburst, and a lurking suspicion sprang up that the Tsaritsa might not be so liberal as they had hoped. And this indeed seems to have proved true, for whatever influence the Tsaritsa has exerted in Russia from that day to this has been in the direction of reaction and severe administration. She has always accepted the point of view of her husband. Nicholas II believes himself a God-ordained autocrat, and the great ambition of his life is not to hand on to his successor a happy and peaceful nation living under a constitutional monarchy, but an absolute autocracy, and Alexandra Feodorovna has supported and worked for the realization of this ambition. When one remembers the glorious and golden romance of this girl, one's imagination is fired to highest heat, and one rejoices when the child who was called Sunny, who early battled bravely with life, was at last coming unto her own. But alas! At the very moment when it would seem that Providence had filled her cup to the full, the dark clouds began to gather, and the little German princess, when she ceased to be Princess Alex, also ceased to be Sunny. Instead of entering upon a period of life rich in blessings, showered with happiness, she faced graver responsibilities, greater hardships, and harder battles than she yet had known. The crudest blows of fate were yet to fall upon her. The wedding of the Tsar and Tsaritsa was almost the only bright day of the winter of 1894 in St. Petersburg society. Mourning was resumed before even the usual wedding ceremonials were ended, and few court functions were held until after the coronation, which took place the following spring. This event was looked forward to by the entire court, and the most elaborate arrangements were made to make it the most magnificent and dazzling spectacle of the kind that a traditionally magnificent court had yet known, an historic occasion, notable from every point of view. During the festivities celebrating this event, the young empress might have been expected to have won all hearts. Instead, the popularity of the dowager was enhanced, and the suspicions against Alexandra, which had been aroused during the wedding celebration, were deepened. Russia, always poor, was in especially straitened circumstances the year of the coronation. Crops had failed, the winter had been severe, and peasants were starving in different parts of the empire. Yet the coronation show cost the government many millions of dollars. The harness worn by the horses that drew the carriage of the Empress alone cost more than $1,000,000. The German princess, born amid frugal surroundings, simply reared, early taught to value pennies, and never affluent, on this occasion found herself in a strange setting indeed. Her coach followed the carriage of the dowager Empress, 8 snow-white horses adorned with red morocco trappings, trimmed with exquisitely engraved gold, champed their teeth on bits of solid gold, and above their heads waved snow-white ostrich plumes. In her shining chariot sat the Empress in a silver and satin gown with an ermine cloak over her shoulders, ropes of diamonds hanging from her shoulders, and a crest of diamonds above her head. How wonderful a change from the life she had always known! Too great a change, perhaps, for even now her manner did not please the populace. The dowager was hailed with acclamations and unprecedented enthusiasm. The Empress was received in dead silence. The situation was an impossible one. She tried to smile upon the throng, but her smiles were stony and cold, and people remarked to one another that she only stared in disdain. After the long and tedious coronation services, as the Emperor was painfully making his way to the Church of the Ascension, staggering under the weight of his royal robes and crown, he stumbled and fell in a long swoon, just as he has fallen ever since under the weight of responsibilities and cares he has never been strong enough to carry. The following day the coronation festivities were interrupted by a terrible catastrophe. Some 5,000 peasants were crushed or trampled to death in a stampede and panic preceding the distribution of certain simple meals which were to have been in honor of the great event of the coronation. The calamity has never been satisfactorily explained, but there seems to have been a general lack of efficiency among those who had the distribution in charge. No sooner was word received of the disaster than the Dowager Empress hurried to the crowded hospitals, administering personal comfort and relief and cheer to the surviving wounded. Her great activity and sympathetic devotion endeared her yet more to the people, and as long as she lives, thousands will revere her for her expressions of grief and solicitude on this occasion. Nicholas, however, made himself conspicuous by doing nothing. On nearly every occasion during the course of his reign, when he has had a signal opportunity for doing the right thing, he has acted precisely as he acted on this occasion. He has turned his back and gone off. And Alexandra Feodorovna has acted in concert with her husband. They both attended the ball at the French embassy that same night, thus horrifying not only Russia, but the civilized world. I do not believe that the Tsaritsa is lacking in heart warmth or human sympathies, but her life is dominated by one man. Before she was an empress, she was a woman, and as a woman she loved, and as a woman she gave all to that love. And to the end of the chapter, one must look for the real life of the Tsaritsa in those spheres where her personal love for this one man holds sway. From the coronation day, the Tsaritsa never regained a place in the affection of the Russian people, and having recognized this fact, and having realized the futility of usurping the place of the Dowager Empress, she simply ceased trying. The Russian people don't dislike her, they merely do not know her. When traveling through the interior of Russia, I constantly heard the Tsar spoken of by the peasants, sometimes reverently, of late more often disdainfully, occasionally in the terms of the old Russian proverb, God is in heaven, and the Tsar is far off. But I do not recall of ever hearing a peasant speak of the Empress. When I have asked about her, the moujiks have invariably shrugged their shoulders in silence. They often have a bright-colored lithograph of her on the walls of their houses, and they all think the picture very beautiful. More than that, they know nor care not at all. Once in an interior village I heard a group of peasants discussing the Tsar with a trace of old-time superstitious reverence, and I asked what of the Empress. A shaggy old mujik shook his tousled head stolidly as he replied, "She is the little father's woman, but what can we know of her?" The Tsaritsa entered upon a life of unusual difficulty from the moment she crossed the Russian frontier. She realized even at the time of her wedding, and more than ever at her coronation, that she was not liked at court, so she did what any sensitive soul would have done under similar circumstances. She turned from the people who criticized her, who failed to appreciate her trying, turned to those whom she loved, who loved her. How many women in our own country have been through just such experiences, not called upon to serve as queens or empresses, but summoned to positions they never were fitted or trained to occupy. With the realization of failure comes a terrible disappointment and sorrow, sometimes heartbreak. Good women then turn to the fruits of love, and in their children seek the salvation necessary to counteract the first failure. The Dowager Empress had never approved of the marriage of Nicholas to Princess Alex. She herself had always been exceedingly popular with the Russian people. In her affliction and bereavement, the sympathy and affection of the nation went out to her. At the coronation of her son and his spouse, her warm personality so completely outshone that of her younger successor as Empress of the people, that a circle of the court immediately gathered about her. From that day to the present time, the influence of the Dowager Empress in her court party has been more potent than that of the Tsaritsa. At times this influence has been directed openly against her rival, and always to the embarrassment of the younger woman. For several years they were not even on speaking terms, and today they rarely meet save on formal occasions when court etiquette demands the presence of them both at some particular function. The attitude of the Dowager Empress has been a source of continual pain to the Tsaritsa, and besides actively militating against her, it has been one more strong influence driving her away from the usual interests and activities, and more into her family life. This estrangement between the two first women of the court has also tended more than anything else to isolate Nicholas. It has resulted in periodic ruptures between the Tsar and his mother, and it has strained his relations with his numerous relatives and important personages of the court who have remained loyal to her. These are some of the reasons why the life which ought to have been bright and happy has been utterly miserable, and now there are indications that a complete nervous breakdown may crown the burden of her years. End of section 15. Section 16 of Royal Romances of Today. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Royal Romances of Today by Kellogg Durland. Part 2, Chapter 4. Motherhood and Queenship. Alexandra Feodorovna, as the wife of the Emperor, was expected to be the mother of an heir to the throne of Russia, and even here long years of enduring pain and travail were before her, for 4 girls were born before a son came to them. When the first child was born, in November 1895, there was disappointment throughout the empire. But the Tsar said a splendid thing at that time. "I am glad," said the royal father, "that our child is a girl. Had it been a boy, he would have belonged to the people. Being a girl, she belongs to us." 1 year and a half after the birth of the Grand Duchess Olga, the second daughter was born, and she was named Tatiana. Marie followed in another 2 years, and Anastasia exactly 2 years later. More than 3 years then elapsed before Alexis, the son and heir, made his appearance. During these 3 years the aid of all kinds of soothsayers and charlatans was invoked to influence the sex of the child. An old priest of the interior, who had been dead 70 years, was canonized in the hope that the miracle of a boy might be worked. This is a story by itself, however, and it would be premature to tell it now. It is well nigh impossible for people in America to understand the disappointment and vexation of the court when girl after girl was born, 4 of them, before the long-awaited son. the Tsaritsa fell more and more into disfavor, and the aristocracy, especially those who were the friends and followers of the dowager, took advantage of the simple, superstitious peasants to point out to them that the empress was not beloved in heaven, or she would have borne a son. When finally a son was born, many people loudly asserted that the boy was a substitution, and not the Tsaritsa's child at all. This was a very malicious thing to say, and was, of course, entirely untrue. The rumor persisted, however, and received certain credence, until it was pointed out that the Dowager Empress was far too watchful and too much at enmity with the Empress to allow any such imposition to be perpetrated. Until the birth of the son, the Tsaritsa took little part in public activity. Indeed, it was not until the war year of 1904, which was also the year of the birth of a son, that she undertook to participate to any extent in work for the nation. After the breaking out of war between Russia and Japan, the Tsaritsa undertook to assist the work of the Red Cross Society. I've seen several of the rooms in the Winter Palace which were turned over to the work of preparing bandages and warm clothing for the wounded soldiers in the hospitals at the front. In connection with this work, the Tsaritsa was conspicuous before the people for the first time since her coronation as Empress, in an undertaking properly belonging to the nation. She gathered together hundreds of young ladies of the court, organized working parties, and before long, among the women of aristocratic circles, it was distinctly the thing to do to belong to one of the Empress's working groups, to prepare warm caps and mufflers and stockings and bandages for the army. The Empress herself worked indefatigably, and so did the two older Grand Duchesses, Olga and Tatiana. They both sewed and knit till their little fingers were stiff and sore. The earnest spirit of patriotic pride and sacrifice exhibited by the Empress at this time was inspiration to thousands of young women in St. Petersburg and Moscow, and on the big estates of rich noblemen throughout the empire. One group of fashionable St. Petersburg girls presented themselves in a body to the Empress with a request that they be sent to the front to serve as volunteer nurses. But the Empress replied, "You are not experienced enough for that work, nor strong enough to endure the hardships of life in Manchuria. What you may do is to serve the hospitals in St. Petersburg, thus enabling the regular trained nurses to go to the front." Almost without exception, these young ladies acted upon this suggestion, and many of them did most excellent service, eventually becoming as useful as nurses who had undergone the usual training in preparation for such work. Some idea of the extent of this work may be gathered from the single fact that in the year 1904, the depot at Karbin alone received from the Winter Palace headquarters, over which the Empress presided in person, no fewer than 11,800,000 articles. In addition to these things, more than $1 million in money was collected and forwarded for the purchase of surgical instruments and such other things as were sorely needed by the badly equipped Russian forces. Some 70 ambulance trains were organized, and a number of chapels and libraries. In thanking the corps of women who had assisted her in this work, the Empress said, "I am happy to know that through the efforts of the workers in my depot, my most ardent desire to give relief to our dear troops has been satisfied." And in a telegram to one of the generals commanding at the front, she said, "Inform the troops in the Far East that I rejoice that it has been given me to lighten even to a slight extent the lot of the unhappy victims of a cruel war who have so self-sacrificingly shed their blood for the honor of the throne of Russia. United in prayer with you all, I lift up to the highest my ardent petition that he may comfort all who have suffered on the field of battle, and continue to keep alive in the heart of the valiant and heroic Russian warriors the feelings of devotion to their duty, their oath, and their love to the fatherland." The Empress also organized the famous dog detachment, by which, with the help of dogs especially trained in Germany, the overlooked wounded were sought out after the tides of battle had swept the Manchurian plains and hills. Unfortunately, this detachment was never given proper opportunity for activity, as the fields of battle almost invariably remained in the hands of the enemy. Besides the Red Cross work, the most important public undertaking of the Tsaritsa has been the establishment of labor aid institutions. This is really an incipient charity enterprise and is being gradually extended to different parts of the empire. Viewed as the charity organization of a great nation, the whole scheme is a ridiculous farce, but viewed as the work of an individual, its proportions seem substantial. A complete list of these institutions practically means a complete list of the charities of the empire, and includes temporary nurseries for babies, homes and asylums for children, lodging houses for workless men, old people's homes, lying-in hospitals, institutions for the insane, libraries and reading rooms, and various depots where simple work is provided for those who are able. I visited a number of these institutions and satisfied myself that, however satisfactory a catalogue of this work might be, that the work itself had small value. It is the crudest and most careless organization of charity I have seen anywhere in the world, and carried on such a trifling scale as to be practically valueless. If the time ever comes when the Russian government can take up the work thus begun, it will be given a value, the value that ultimately accrues to all pioneer work. There are more starving peasants in Russia every year than in any country of the Western world. The numbers annually mount up to the millions. In 1906, there were 27 millions in the famine belt. The beggars and workless, the maimed and the crippled victims of the war, fill the streets of all the large cities. A lodging house for 50 or 100 men in a city where 50,000 are in want is the merest drop in the bucket. The schools for girls are better equipped and better endowed than any of the other institutions embraced in this work, and this is owing to the personal interest of the Empress in girls. This interest of the Tsaritsas in girls is doubtless owing to the fact that she has so many daughters of her own. Many of the schools which she has helped to start and to support have been named after her own little girls. The Olga Children's Homes in St. Petersburg and Moscow were first inaugurated in 1898 and now are on a firm foundation. In Russia, the labor aid institutions are treated lightly. Even friends of the Empress speak of them as trivial. Judged by their present capacities, they are trivial. They are badly managed. They offer rich opportunities for what is variously called protection, patronage, and graft, opportunities which are fully taken advantage of, as I saw for myself in several of the places which I visited. There were elaborate offices, luxuriously fitted with select furnishings, and small regiments of young aristocrats and noblemen, like all public servants of rank in Russia, called chinovniks, serving as clerks and directors, positions of absolute sinecure, carrying rich emoluments. Not one of these institutions, outside of the orphanages, would stand the test of scientific charity or philanthropy. For all this, I am inclined to give the work a higher value than do the Russian people, for, after all, Russia will one day be a modern nation in forms and institutions, and then all of this work will needs be developed. It will then be good to have this little experiment scattered about the country. It may prove the foundation for a work of worthy proportions, and I am glad that the Empress may claim credit for most of what has been done. There are schools and institutions of one sort or another named after each of the children, as well as after the Empress herself, and to all of these the Empress contributes annually from her private purse. In no sense can any or all of these enterprises be considered a great work, but they are all characteristic of the Tsaritsa. It is indicative of simple human sympathies. It is quiet and unostentatious, almost timidly so, but the idea underlying it all is real. The court of Nicholas II does not entertain nearly so frequently nor so lavishly as the preceding courts of the last 100 years. This is partly owing to the temperament of the present Tsar and the retiring characteristic of the Tsaritsa, and also because of the troubled and distraught condition of the empire during the last several years. Several court balls each winter are required, however, and on these occasions the Tsaritsa is always a conspicuous figure. Her own enjoyment at these royal functions may well be questioned. In the first place, there are certain aged ministers, ambassadors, and potentates with whom she must dance. Doubtless these eminent worthies are frequently endowed with great dignity, but statesmanship and imposing presence do not make up for grace and ease and tripping figures to light music. And if perchance the Tsaritsa would waltz with a brilliant young officer or charming courtier, all the other dancers must at once stop and clear the floor for the Empress and her favored partner. To be thus observed by all observers cannot be otherwise than trying to one of so modest and retiring a nature. Years before, when the Tsaritsa was still only Princess Alex of Hesse, she had visited St. Petersburg as the guest of her sister Elizabeth, who had married the Grand Duke Sergius. During one of the dances at a certain ball given during this visit, Princess Alex slipped on the polished floor and fell. Her partner, as well as a number of young officers, sprang toward her to assist her to her feet, but the Grand Duke chanced to be near, and he too sprang to her assistance. Instantly the embarrassed partner and other officers stepped back. The privilege of assisting the confused and blushing princess was the prerogative of the Grand Duke, because of his exalted position. When the Tsaritsa does participate in a public function, she does it with a stateliness and grace that commands respect, whatever of coldness her manner may suggest. I had the privilege of being near to her on one of these occasions. It was on the 10th day of May, 1906, in the throne room of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. The Emperor had called together the First Duma, and the members of this extraordinary body, together with the Council of Empire and the entire court, were assembled to hear the speech from the throne. It was the first time in 16 months that the royal family had visited the capital. These 16 months had been characterized by almost continuous revolutionary activity, successive mutinies in the army and navy, general strikes, and disturbances of every description. There is wide speculation as to the probable outcome of this meeting between the Tsar and the representatives of the people. To us, remarked one of the ladies of honor attached to the Empress, to us it is like letting the revolution into the palace. This reception of the elected deputies of the people. Members of the court were fearful lest the Tsar would never return from the throne room. Many, if not most of the nobles present, went in fear and trembling, and went because they had been commanded by the Emperor and for no other reason. I met one well-known prince the morning of that day, and he immediately bade me congratulate him, as he had been excused from appearing at the function. When the music of the national anthem was heard, announcing the approach of the royal party, the atmosphere of the throne room became so tense that it was painful. Not one person in the room dared think what the next minute might bring forth. When the Tsar and the Grand Dukes and the Empress and the Dowager Empress and the Grand Duchesses were all assembled before the richly attired metropolitans and high priests for the interminable preliminary blessings, the slightest sound echoed throughout the room. So still and strained was every human being in the room. The nervousness of the Tsar was apparent to all. The agitation of the Grand Dukes was laughable, especially the manifestations of their fear and their repeated and excited crossing of themselves. Even correspondents, schooled and trained to recklessness and all kinds of danger, and calm to the point of being blasé in the face of any situation, breathed hard and showed the terrible strain and tension of the minutes. The Empresses alone appeared in full command of every nerve and muscle. I looked upon the Tsaritsa in silent admiration. The picture of her strong, immovable figure is imaged forever upon my memory. The fluttering of a glove or a handkerchief from the balcony to the floor would surely have upset the entire assemblage, in spite of its magnificent show of military symbols, buttons, medals, and gold and silver trappings. The thought came to me there, and I have recalled it many times since. Had such an untoward incident occurred, the Tsaritsa alone, or at least the Empresses alone, would have had stood stolid. The exquisite poise and complete possession of the Tsaritsa commanded absolute admiration. Cold and indifferent she may be toward the people of her court, but on an occasion like this she certainly acquits herself with rare credit. At all times a magnificent woman to look upon, tall, statuesque, imposing, imperial, she never appeared to better advantage than on this occasion. With her, somewhat back in the procession, were the 4 older children of the Tsar and Tsaritsa, Olga, Tatiana, Marie, and Anastasia. These little girls bear the title of Grand Duchess, and in them has the life of the Tsaritsa long been centered. Presently I shall have a number of stories to tell of their nursery days. As we go on we shall learn how completely the life and time of the Tsaritsa have been taken up with her children and their home and family life. Easter is one of the greatest fetes of the year in Russia. The long Lenten fast is usually kept rigorously by all classes over whom the Church maintains dominion, and even by many who have ceased to reverence orthodoxy, but in whom the instinct of traditional observance remains. On Easter Eve there is a tremendously solemn service in all of the churches in the land. At the stroke of midnight, priests and choir burst forth in loud hallelujahs, and all the people shout, "Christ is risen! Christ is risen!" and greet one another with a holy kiss. Everybody kisses everybody else in sight, regardless of previous acquaintance. I remember standing bolt upright in a fearful press in St. Isaac's Cathedral one Easter Eve for 2 mortal hours in the middle of the night, the atmosphere hot and fetid, till even men swooned, and all wearied unspeakably. On Easter morning presents are exchanged, and masters and mistresses greet all the servants of their household with the holy kiss. The Tsar and Tsaritsa observe this custom as religiously as the humblest of their subjects, and every palace maid and stable boy is greeted in this way. Long before the hour when the Emperor and Empress are to receive the household, there is great excitement below stairs, where all the servants busily scrub their honest faces with soap and water till they shine like great apples in preparation for the kiss of their imperial master and mistress. The Tsar kisses every man in the palace, even to the soldiers on duty, and the Empress every maid servant. On one occasion the Tsaritsa remarked that she sometimes thought the Emperor had rather the better of it, because of the new leather that the soldiers wear on that day, and which smells so nice. In view of the fact that court observances would naturally expect the Tsaritsa to play the role of Empress, rather than of mother and wife as her life work, it is the more extraordinary that this mighty queen, in point of power and opportunity, has chosen the quieter life of the home. In addition to the private fortune of the Tsar, an immense income accrues from the gold and precious stone mines of Siberia, which are worked by convicts for the private purse of the Emperor, and from the vast timber holdings that he controls. Besides all this, the government officially grants him a salary of nearly $5 million a year, which is paid to him in monthly installments of $400,000 each. The Tsaritsa, as head of the royal household, is mistress of nearly 30,000 servants, scattered in many palaces and residences throughout the empire. It is not likely that this vast retinue is any particular care to her, for the army of servants, just like the army of soldiers, is divided into groups and officered by various functionaries. In fact, it is likely that the 2 armies are not dissimilar in the minds of the Tsar and Tsaritsa. Every wish of the Tsar's is a command to the army, and is only to be uttered to an aide to be executed. So the word of the Tsaritsa spoken to a lady-in-waiting is all sufficient to be carried out by any or all of her servant host. There are 50,000 head of cattle in the royal pastures and 5,000 horses in the royal stables. Over all these, the Tsaritsa is supreme, as the wife and consort of the Tsar, and 140 million subjects besides. The point of her whole life as Empress is that when Princess Alex married Nicholas, she gave herself and all of her activity to Nicholas, not to the Russian nation. Every act of hers has become one of personal devotion. If Princess Alex had been ambitious, as many women of the court circles are, or if she had never loved so intensely and so blindly, the world, looking back upon her career as it does today, might have deemed her a better empress. As it happened, circumstances throughout her life have all driven her back from the public role, and more into the circle of the family. Thus it comes about that the chronicler of her life must pass lightly over her life as Empress, and dwell at length upon those sides of her character which the words wife and mother indicate. In other words, her entire life has been one long romance, a life of devotion to her husband and to her children, and this at the expense of her duties as Empress. As the years have passed, the disposition of the child once called Sonny has altered and changed, and the lines of wistful pathos which have settled round her still lovely face are doubtless indication of the drops of gall that have tainted her cup of life's happiness. For all these mellowing lines, the Tsaritsa wears an expression that in many lights is of that unusual otherworldly beauty so seldom seen in the great world of today, but common to so many of the women whose portraits have been left us by the world artists of the Middle Ages. It is an expression that appears and ripens only under soul development, and as we see it in the Tsaritsa, we do not find it difficult to understand and trace, for a considerable part of her life has been given over to religious thought and contemplation, and not to the study of theological doctrines and controversies only, but to the deeper truths of spiritualism and mysticism, truths whose elusiveness holds them forever remote to all save the few, and whose realities are measured only by the standards of the external verities. This brings us to one of the most extraordinary and at the same time one of the fascinating sides of the life of the Tsaritsa. End of section 16. Section 17 of Royal Romances of Today. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Royal Romances of Today by Kellogg Durland. Part 2, Chapter 5. Spirit Whisperings. An interesting trait of the forebears of Princess Alex was their belief in ghosts. Presently we shall see that Princess Alex, even after she became Tsaritsa, gave much of her time to the study of the mystics, and has always had spiritualistic tendencies and beliefs in the supernatural. Most of the Dukes of Hesse are credited with similar superstitions. Duke George II, who lived in the 17th century, is said to have seen the ghost of his dead brother Wilhelm on one occasion. Before the death of Wilhelm there had been a quarrel between the two brothers. The ghost chastened and severely reproached Duke George for his bitterness and hatred. The incident made such an impression upon him that as long as he lived he could not shake off the spell of the weird experience. Another Duke of Hesse, William, had a lifelong terror of ghosts and always slept in a brilliantly lighted room. A story is on record of this man that he once returned to one of his hunting lodges at night, when suddenly all of the lights went out. A great wind magically arose, doors slammed, windows shook, and presto, the lights as suddenly reappeared, but all of the soldiers of the guard had mysteriously vanished, and the entire lodge was dismantled. Long before this, the lodge was reputed haunted, so that when the Duke was there, the soldiers of the guard were changed every 30 minutes, and the whole establishment kept well lighted. Just prior to the birth of the 5th child to the Empress, a phase of temperament developed, which attracted the attention and comment of the world. From early childhood, the Princess Alex had manifested an interest in things philosophical and theological. Back in her old home at Darmstadt, the royal betrothal had once nearly been broken owing to the religious scruples of the bride-to-be. Princess Alex could not convince herself or be convinced that she was right in renouncing the Protestant faith of her mother and adopting that of the Greek Catholic Church. Finally, her love for Nicholas overcame her scruples of conscience. She forced herself to accept the doctrines of the State Church of Russia. Priests who had been assigned to tutor her to this day relate their experiences and difficulties in meeting the arguments and answering the questions brought up by the princess. The familiarity which she exhibited with German theological writings and philosophical theories confused them. In Russia, as Empress, she continued to encourage her interest in religious doctrines and theories. The friends of her own choosing were generally men and women with whom she could discuss vital religious problems. Surrounded as she was by an atmosphere perennially surcharged with the sense of impending tragedy, she not unnaturally developed pronounced morbid tendencies. From time to time she believed that she caught the glint of certain gleams of spiritual truths in the distance, and these she pursued with that fatal persistence which so often leads people, especially women of temperamental or melancholy tendencies, to ultimately accept various isms. The Tsaritsa became more and more markedly spiritualistic. By nature and by training she was retiring and preferred the splendid isolation of the court in her home circle to the more brilliant opportunities offered her by her supreme social position. These tendencies toward retirement, encouraged as they were by the court, which did not take kindly to her, nor exhibit at any time the cordiality and friendliness generally accorded queens, she came to live more and more in the realms of the spiritual. She carried her intellectual interests far beyond the things we know, and over into the borderland of faith and belief. To those who knew her well, it was not a matter of special surprise when, after the birth of 3 children and no heir to the throne, the Tsaritsa turned an open ear to various men who claimed supernatural control over things physical. Prior to the birth of Anastasia, the aid of eminent medical and scientific men was sought to influence, if possible, the sex of the next child, but all to no avail. What pangs of bitterness must sometimes have come to her mother heart when she remembered the 2 boys whose father was also the father of her daughters, 2 sons who could never be recognized by their own father, and who were destined forever to be exiled to a foreign land because of the blot on their scutcheon. What piercing irony of fate for the father who must sometimes have remembered his outcast sons upon whom he had bestowed the bastard mark, while the birth of a legitimate son and heir was so long deferred. When science failed, religion and spiritualism were appealed to. Rumors were rife of various charlatans imported from one place or another to practice their magic. Of these, the one who came to be most widely known was called Philippe. Philippe first joined the royal entourage at Livadia. Later he was brought to Moscow and St. Petersburg, and for several years he is said to have exercised great influence not only over the Empress, but over the Tsar as well. The Tsar has ever been an impressionable man, and though he has displayed all the stubbornness of a weak nature, he has frequently been under the domination of others. Just as he was willing to lend a ready ear to Pobedonostsev and to his uncle, the great Duke Sergius, so also was he willing to listen to charlatans who came to him well recommended. It was under the reactionary Grand Ducal party that Philippe was brought to Russia. In course of time this man came to be known as the Tsar's magician. An atmosphere of profound mystery always surrounded Philippe, although of the extent of his domination there never was any question. From all that I can gather, the man's name was Philippe Landard. Landard is supposed to have been the son of a shepherd, and that he was born in a small village situated high among the French Alps. When quite a boy, his father would regularly take him to the local abattoir, and on one of these visits he made the acquaintance of a butcher who took the boy into his employ. Landard possessed imagination even as a child, as is evinced by the fact that his contract with the slaughterhouse prompted him with the desire to become a surgeon. With this hope in view, he attended evening classes and night lectures in the medical school at Lyons. Handicapped, however, by lack of money, and presumably not endowed with keenest intelligence, he never succeeded in passing the examinations necessary to admit him to practice. What he did succeed in doing, however, was to discover and develop certain magnetic powers which he undoubtedly had, powers of personality which he cultivated remarkably. He turned this power especially in the direction of healing. He practiced autosuggestion, and by the judicious use of massage frequently succeeded in convincing people that his healing powers were literally real. Ultimately, he was able to establish himself as a thaumaturgist and practicing healer in the Rue Tape d'Or at Lyons, where he acquired considerable local notoriety, which presently spread all over France among people who believed in his art. At least twice he is said to have been arrested and charged by the police as an illegal practitioner. This led him to be more discreet in his methods, and he refrained from ever writing a prescription or committing himself in writing on any point. The leader of the French school of occultism became interested in him, and through him he met Dr. George von Lansdorff of Freiburg. Dr. von Lansdorff had been brought to Russia by the Grand Duke Constantine Nikolaevich and presented to the Emperor Alexander II, who had actually commissioned him to sense out and unravel nihilistic conspiracies. Dr. von Lansdorff, whether through the connivance of the political police or not, we do not know, succeeded in foretelling certain plots which actually materialized. He attained considerable notoriety in connection with the blowing up of the dining room of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg in 1880. Dr. von Lansdorff evinced considerable interest in Landard, but unlike von Lansdorff and other members of the French school of occultism, Landard ascribed his supernatural powers, both in matters of healing and prophecy, to divine influence. That is to say, whereas the French practitioners were avowedly irreligious and proclaimed themselves free thinkers, Landard cultivated the spiritual element and professed himself a religious man. Through von Lansdorff, Landard was brought into contact with certain members of the Russian colony of royalties who annually visited the Riviera. It was upon their invitation that Philippe visited Nice, and while there was fortunate enough to win the favor of the Grand Duke Alexis. This was accomplished through curing the Grand Duke of a painful attack of rheumatism of the knee by his laying on of the hands method in magnetism. The Grand Duke Alexis passed Philippe on to the Grand Duchess Vladimir, who in turn brought him to Russia and was instrumental in having him put in touch with Tsar Nicholas II. From all accounts, Philippe was a man of courage, personality, of winning and sympathetic manner. The Tsar frankly liked him, and before long Philippe was established as a more or less permanent member of the royal household. The Emperor consulted Philippe on all kinds of personal questions, and later sought his counsel in regard to the weightiest questions of state. It has even been said that during the winter of 1902-1903, the influence of Philippe had grown so supreme that a determined protest was submitted to the Tsar by the members of his council and ministers, including Comte Witt. Philippe was retired for a time from practice, but was still retained as a member of the royal household, and privately Nicholas continued to listen to the spiritualistic haverings of this man. From time to time Landard also appeared to effect cures upon various members of the royal household and of the court. These things naturally tended to strengthen his position and to enhance his prestige. The result of these manifestations of power upon Emperor Nicholas was to confirm his confidence in Philippe's supernatural connections. In him Nicholas thought he had found another, if not the actual reincarnation of Joan of Arc. Nicholas seems to have had little difficulty in persuading the Empress to trust in the potency of Philippe's power in regard to influencing the sex of their next child. At all events, the next child proved to be a son. Philippe claimed much of the credit for this, but it is evident that the entire credit was not accorded him by the royal family, inasmuch as a certain parish priest in the province of Tambov was later given credit for exerting a like influence. The priest had been dead many years, but his tomb had been made a kind of shrine by the moujiks, and it had been annually visited by barren women who claimed to have found in the shrine the secret of fruitfulness and also the spirit of influencing the sex of unborn children. The effect of Philippe's ministrations upon the Tsaritsa led her still deeper within the portals of the spirit world. To conclude the story of Philippe, it is said that he became intoxicated with the power and confidence bestowed in him by the royal family, and that he overshot himself at the time of the Russo-Japanese War. He is supposed to have been largely instrumental in persuading Nicholas to take the attitude that he did which brought about the war, and throughout the long, disastrous campaign was continually prophesying a turn in the tide which never came. Landard is said to have represented to the emperor that he had been selected by divine inspiration to assure the emperor that the war in Manchuria would inaugurate a new and great era of Russian glory that would forever overshadow the Yellow Peril, which at that time was popularly feared to be menacing Europe. When disaster followed disaster, members of the court and royal household lost faith in Philippe, and finally the Tsar himself ordered him to leave Russia within 48 hours. This banishment proved a great blow to Landard, who, heartbroken and covered with disgrace, returned to his own native villa of St. Julien des Arbres, where he died the following year from a complication of internal disorders. Despite the downfall of Philippe, the faith of the Empress was not shaken in the least in things mystic and spiritual, and there is ample evidence that this inherent characteristic has in reality become a veritable second nature. Miss Margaret Eager, an Irish lady of good education, was called to Russia in the year 1899 to serve in the capacity of nursery governess to the royal family. Miss Eager is very much of a Celt. She has a profound belief in the philosophy of mysticism, and indeed she herself seems to be possessed of certain supernatural powers, second sight, visions, and dreams that come true. Miss Eager related to me various occurrences in the royal family concerning strange and seemingly mystical manifestations. Miss Eager herself firmly believes in the reality of the spiritualistic sense of the Empress. When the Grand Duchess Olga was 3 years old, she was taken ill with a gastric attack from which she did not fully recover for 2 or 3 weeks, the attack itself in its severe form, keeping the royal child in bed 3 or 4 days. The first time Miss Eager left the bedside of the sick child for a breath of fresh air, she went for a walk along the quays of the Neva. Upon her return, as she entered the room, little Olga looked up and said, "An old lady was here." "What old lady?" she asked. "An old lady who wears a blue dress," the child replied. Miss Eager was frankly puzzled, because the court was in mourning at that time, and there was no one wearing a blue dress. "Surely you mean blue. What kind of blue?" questioned Miss Eager. "It was not like mamma's," and the child paused. Miss Eager thought perhaps one of the maids had had a visitor, and so they were all questioned, but nobody knew of any visitor during Miss Eager's absence, and so the matter for the moment was dropped and dismissed by Miss Eager as a possible vagary of the child's imagination. A few days later, Miss Eager was sitting on the floor with the royal children in a certain room in the royal palace, playing at building castles of cards. Suddenly Olga looked up and exclaimed, "There is the old lady in blue." "Where? Where?" said Miss Eager and the other children. "There, she came through the bedroom door. She is standing at the door now." Miss Eager quickly caught up the child and ran through the bedroom into the room beyond, and into yet another room, but she could find no one, nor could she hear any footsteps. "Well," said Olga to Miss Eager, "you must be very stupid, because the old lady was there." 2 days later, the Empress directed Miss Eager to take the child to the chapel in the Winter Palace, and there, in the hall on the way to the chapel, are 2 life-size portraits of the Emperor Alexander II and his wife. Looking at the picture of Alexander II's wife, Olga said, "Why, that is the lady I saw in the blue dress, and see, her dress is not the dress mamma wears." The identification was made by the Grand Duchess with the utmost assurance. Now, this incident by itself would have no significance, but Miss Eager relates in connection with it other incidents which give it interesting if fantastic value. Miss Eager, during her long stay in the royal household, always slept with the nursery. One night, she maintained, she distinctly heard a voice coming from directly beneath her bed. The voice was far off and weird, and was as of one weeping bitterly and making terrible complaints, and the language used was French. The story she was relating was one of extreme intimacy. Miss Eager says that she sat up in bed to try to locate from whence the sounds were coming, but no sooner had she raised herself upright than the voice ceased. Upon laying her head on the pillow again, the voice resumed, and the complaints were of her husband's unfaithfulness. While Miss Eager was still meditating the extraordinary experience, the Empress, as was her wont, entered the room, and Miss Eager asked her what room was directly beneath the rooms they were then in. The Empress replied, "Merely storerooms." Miss Eager then said to the Empress, "But there is some poor woman there, and suffering from a most terrible affliction. The Empress replied, "What are you saying?" Whereupon Miss Eager related what she had just experienced. The Empress then asked if the words were spoken in English. "No," replied Miss Eager, "it is French. At first I thought it might be the cook, but that is impossible, because the French spoken was very pure and elegant." The Empress then said that if Miss Eager thought there was anyone below, she had better get out of bed and listen at the floor, which she did, but could hear nothing. The Empress then told her to get back into bed and go to sleep. Immediately her head touched the pillow, the voice was again audible to her. Suddenly the Empress said, "Tell me, does it remind you of anything you have heard before? Do you know anything of the story of this room before it was done up for my little ones?" Miss Eager replied that she knew that the wife of Alexander II slept in this room, and then she recalled having heard that this woman was very unhappy because of her husband's numerous peccadilloes with other women. She recalled also that the Princess Dolgoruki was Alexander II's mistress. His wife, who used this room over a long period of time, used nightly to bury her face in her pillow and cry aloud. After she recalled these things, the Empress said, "Yes, but before she died, she went to the Dolgoruki and told her of her unhappiness, using the very self-same words that you have just repeated to me as having heard while on your pillow." The Empress thereupon told Miss Eager that she was sleeping on the very bed which Alexander II's wife had used, and upon which she died. The next day the Empress herself insisted that the entire furnishings of the room be changed, and that a new bed be installed. It is said that Alexander II, after the death of his wife, wanted to marry the Princess Dolgoruki, which indeed he may have done morganatically. Miss Eager was deeply impressed by this experience, and in the mind of the Empress there was no question or shadow of doubt whatever. Another incident related by Miss Eager in connection with the Empress occurred in the palace at Peterhof. One night, according to her custom, the Empress entered Miss Eager's room. Miss Eager relates that she awoke to find herself being shaken by Her Majesty, who was crying, "Awake, awake, come back!" And when Miss Eager came to her senses, she realized that she was crying bitterly. "What is it? What is it?" exclaimed the Empress. "I've been here 5 minutes shaking you, and you would not wake up. What is the matter?" Miss Eager replied that she must have had a nightmare. The Empress insisted upon knowing what Miss Eager had seen in her unhappy dream, whereupon the nursery governess related that in her dream she appeared to be in a town of some far distant country, a southern land. The streets were badly lighted, many of them were narrow, and the people round about her who filled the streets were dark and swarthy. Traversing the streets, she presently came to a great building before which a crowd had collected. As she stood and wondered what interest held the people, an open carriage drove up. The thought flashed through her mind, royalty must be expected. Who can it be? Just then out of the building came an elderly gentleman whom Miss Eager did not recognize, but he was followed closely by a man in uniform. After the man got into the carriage, there was the glint of flashing steel, and immediately the oldish man dropped back, apparently lifeless. At once all was turned into a mad dream, and Miss Eager found herself trying to crush the Empress and the royal princesses under the seat of the carriage, whereupon the Empress laughed and said, "You can see for yourself that it was only a dream, for you could not shove me under the seat of the carriage, even if you could succeed in putting the children there." When the Empress had gone, Miss Eager once more drifted off into sleep. In the morning, when she awoke, she was tired and nervous, as if after some long journey. When Mary, the nurse, came in, she said, "Why, Miss Eager, what is the matter with you this morning?" And Miss Eager told her that in the night she had had a terrible dream in which she had seen a man in a carriage murdered. At breakfast time, when she saw the Empress, she said, "Have you had any more nightmares?" And then turning to the Emperor, who had just entered the room, Her Majesty directed Miss Eager to relate to him the hideous dream of the night before. Whereupon Miss Eager related the unhappy scenes of her nightmare. The Tsar listened with the utmost attention, and when Miss Eager had finished speaking, he said, "Miss Eager, I hope that you won't be very much frightened, because what you saw in your dream last night was an incident which occurred in a town of northern Italy, where His Majesty King Humbert was assassinated at precisely the hour the Empress entered your room, and in that manner that you describe in your dream." Miss Eager, like a flash, remembered the picture she had seen of the late King of Italy, and it was the man whom she had seen enter the carriage, followed by the officer in uniform. As the Tsar told her of this, he held in his hand a telegram which had just been received detailing the news of this assassination. On one occasion the Empress told Miss Eager that all her life she had been much interested in the spiritual world, but that she had come to the conclusion that it was wrong to meddle with such things, because if there was anything in it, it must come from the devil. Early one evening the Empress entered the nursery and told the children that she was going to dinner and would probably be very late, consequently would not come in to see them on her return, as was her wont. There was going to be a séance after the dinner. The next day Miss Eager took occasion to ask Her Majesty if she had enjoyed the séance. The Tsaritsa proceeded to tell her all about a clairvoyant called Philippe, but with a note of bitterness in her recital, for she said that Philippe had mesmerized her husband and made him do exactly what he told him. The Empress steadfastly refused to see Philippe after that. Just what occurred at this séance the Empress never did say, at least to Miss Eager, but it was clear to her that Her Majesty had been unfavorably impressed, and that she would have nothing more to do with the mysterious Frenchman. Considerable pressure was brought to bear upon the Empress by various ladies of the court to persuade her to go once more to Philippe, but she never would do it. These incidents indicating this phase of the Tsaritsa's character are, of course, sympathetically interpreted by Miss Eager, because she herself believes so absolutely in the spirit world, in dreams and intuitions. For example, before Port Arthur was besieged, Miss Eager in a dream saw its fall and told the Empress about it. The Empress afterwards reminded her of this dream, and deeply regretted that the Tsar had not taken counsel from Miss Eager's vision rather than from Philippe. On another occasion Miss Eager told Mary, the nurse, to go and tell a certain liftman in the palace that he was not to work that day, as in a dream she had seen him terribly crushed and mangled. But Mary laughed and refused to convey the message. Miss Eager thought it seemed rather foolish, and so did not insist upon sending the message to the man. That afternoon, when she returned from the daily drive with the Grand Duchesses, the Empress sent for her and said, "Miss Eager, this morning you told Mary to warn the liftman not to work today, and Mary refused to carry your message." Miss Eager said, "Yes, that is true." "Well," said the Empress, "I sent for you because I wanted to tell you myself that while you were out with the children, the liftman was killed." Another curious incident, which is hard to explain, occurred at the time of the death of Princess Ella, a daughter of the Grand Duke of Hesse, a charming child of 7 years who succumbed to an illness of only 36 hours' duration, apparently ptomaine poisoning. The child was staying at that time with her royal aunt and uncle, the Tsar and Tsaritsa, at the palace in Poland. While the child was ill, and just before her life spark was extinguished, 2 of the Russian Grand Duchesses, Olga and Tatiana, who were sleeping together in a neighboring room, suddenly began to scream frantically. The Empress, the physicians in attendance upon Princess Ella, and Miss Eager rushed into the room where the children were, and saw them standing in their beds and shrieking in horror. It was long before they could be pacified, and then they told how they had seen a strange man with flowing robes and great wings walk through their room. While they were still telling of the fearful apparition, the eyes of both the children suddenly became dilated with terror, and both of them, simultaneously pointing in the same direction, cried, "Look, look, there he is again! Don't you see him? He is going to Ella's room. Poor Ella! Poor Ella!" Of course, none of the adults could see anything, and the physicians assured the Empress that it was but an attack of childish hysteria which had suddenly and strangely come upon both children. Only a few moments later the Empress and the physicians were hurriedly summoned to the bedside of the dying child, who, lapsing into a state of coma, died in the Tsaritsa's arms. To this day the Empress, as well as the Emperor and Miss Eager, are convinced that the children actually saw this angel of death passing into the room of the dying princess. At least, it is true that there are many similar inexplicable cases on record of children and sometimes of animals, as well as of dying persons, having supernatural vision at moments of death. Horses, for example, have been known to become terror-stricken when passing the scene of a murder, while the well-known death rap is of common occurrence that there can be no doubt of its existence. These incidents are related in order to explain much that is otherwise inexplicable in the character of the Tsaritsa. The mental development which she has experienced through her entire life has been logical and in natural consequence, and in natural sequence. Her early philosophical and theological interests have simply been developed abnormally in the abnormal environment in which she has lived. While the Empress has been ever skeptical when conversing with her friends and reluctant to accept as reality manifestations of the spirit world, there can be no doubt that both she and the Emperor have nevertheless been secretly convinced that they are both instruments of God, as well as possessing the power of holding converse with the spirit world. This is proved by the canonization of Seraphim, the parish priest of Tambov, whose tomb they visited prior to the birth of the heir, Alexis. Seraphim had been dead 70 years, but the Tsar, anxious to leave no stone unturned to procure a son and heir, encouraged by the Tsaritsa, insisted upon the canonization of Seraphim. When the remains of the old priest were unearthed, it was found that the body was badly decomposed, and to canonize a man whose body yields to the influence of decomposition is contrary to the traditions and customs of the Church. Orthodox Bishop Dmitry of Tambov made bold to call attention to this fact and protest the canonization of Seraphim. For his temerity, the Tsar, deeply angered, ordered that Dmitry be deprived of his see and exiled to Vyatka. According to Emperor Nicholas, the preservation of bones, hair, and teeth were sufficient qualification for saintship. Furthermore, His Majesty was upheld in this by various sycophant but prophetic monks, who with sublime assurance allowed that God will one day work a miracle and restore Seraphim's body. So Seraphim was canonized with great pomp and ritualistic solemnity. If anything were needed to fasten the belief of the Tsar and Tsaritsa in these extreme forms of religion, it was the patent answer to their faith and trust in Philippe and Seraphim. The boy was called Alexis, and he was born on July 30th, 1904, according to the Russian calendar, and since that time Tsar and Tsaritsa have been given more and more to spiritualistic religion. End of section 17. Section 18 of Royal Romances of Today. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Royal Romances of Today by Kellogg Durland. Part 2, Chapter 6. Family Life at the Russian Court. Of recent years, since the war with Japan and the revolutionary outbreak in 1905 and 1906, few court functions have been held. In the ordinary daily routine, the Tsaritsa prefers to breakfast alone, to lunch with only one lady-in-waiting, and the Emperor with but one adjutant. The dinners are likewise simple as often as is possible. The older children are brought in for meals when there are no guests. The tastes of both Tsar and Tsaritsa are equally simple as to food and to dress. The Tsar's favorite uniform is that of colonel of one of his regiments, except in the summer when he frequently appears in hunting costume, an English Norfolk jacket, knee trousers, and leggings or high boots. English is the language generally used by the royal family when alone, English and German. The Tsaritsa speaks Russian quite correctly, but with a marked German accent. This is not strange in view of the fact that she did not begin to study the language until after her betrothal. Like most Germans, she speaks French poorly, and consequently French has never been a popular language with them, although the Tsar speaks it most excellently well. Because English is used so much by the Emperor and Empress, it is the popular language in court circles and among officers. Many Russians send their children to England when they are very young in order that English may be their first language. I've known many Russians who spoke English absolutely perfectly, fluently, and without the slightest trace of foreign accent. The children of the Tsar and Tsaritsa use English most. The Tsaritsa's voice is low and deep, not unmusical. Her laugh is light, usually breaking into a silvery falsetto. She is slightly taller than the Tsar, being about 5 feet 8 and 1/2 inches, while he is barely 5 feet 8 inches. Her face still wears an expression of soft, wistful beauty, which is enhanced by a small mole near the corner of her mouth. It is so small that it frequently is not noticed at all, but if one stands near her it is observed, and not unpleasantly. Miss Eager relates an incident which reveals the curious stolidity, not to say cold-bloodedness, of the character of the Empress. The Empress had gone to the christening of a battleship at St. Petersburg, and returned to the palace at St. Petersburg in the evening. In the nursery the Empress told Miss Eager how the officers of the ship had been drawn up in line for the ceremony when a sudden thunderstorm had descended, and a peculiarly vivid flash of lightning had struck a flagstaff near by, shattering as it fell and striking some of the officers. One man rolled right to the feet of the Empress, and her dress had been splashed with blood. The Dowager Empress had fainted at this sight, but the Empress herself insisted that the man had died in the service of his country, and that consequently it was not a matter for mourning. Of late years the health of the Empress has been decidedly shattered. During the summer of 1910 the Tsar took her for a long holiday to Germany. She visited her childhood home of Darmstadt, and later took a cure at a watering place known for its beneficial effects upon people suffering from nervous and heart disorders. During the summer of 1907, when the imperial family were holidaying on the yacht Standard off the islands of Finland, there was an attempt to do away with the entire family, the full details of which have never leaked out into the broad world. It is known, however, that this attempt was the result of a conspiracy which included some of the officers and men of the royal yacht. The shock which the Empress sustained at that time she never recovered from, and more or less sensational rumors are frequently given to the world suggesting the precarious condition of her mind as well as of her nerves. From this extraordinarily exclusive family life, which is at present the rule at Peterhof and Tsarskoe Selo, the two places where the imperial family spend most of their time, the Tsar has come to be spoken of among the Grand Dukes and people of the court as the little married man. This phrase is indicative of the supercilious way the family life is regarded in Russia. Americans are frequently horrified at the nonchalant way that Russian nobles flaunt their mistresses about the streets and public restaurants of St. Petersburg. The Tsar, as a young man, was probably as fast as any of the court, but after his marriage he settled down wonderfully. Whether he still has his wayward periods, as gossip sometimes asserts, I do not know. On the whole, he is a good husband and a fond father. He undoubtedly appreciates the tremendous love the Tsaritsa pours upon him. The attitude of the Tsaritsa toward the education of the Russian people will seem somewhat extraordinary to Americans, though after all it is probably consistent with her life. In this, as in everything else, she accepts the attitude of her liege and lord, the sovereign of the Russian people. When a certain Count Tolstoy, not the late Leo Tolstoy, was Minister of Public Instruction, he once appealed to the Empress to aid him in extending the educational advantages of the Empire to the girls and young women of the country. I have Count Tolstoy's own permission to relate this incident. The Tsaritsa listened to the minister attentively as he set forth the needs of Russia in this direction, and when he had concluded, she replied that she thought all young girls should be taught to sew, to care for their homes, in short, to become healthful wives and good mothers. But as for granting them the privileges of so-called higher education, knowledge of history, philosophy, and the sciences, to this she was entirely opposed, because these studies, when offered to women, only result in such terrible times as Russia is now passing through. This surely is a remarkable tribute to the women of Russia, the Tsaritsa holding them responsible for the movement toward liberty and freedom as a result of their contact with education and culture. On the other hand, the Tsaritsa sometimes generously encourages the extension of school opportunities to individual girls whose efforts happen to have been brought to her attention. For example, Miss Eager, who for 6 years was governess to the little Grand Duchesses, and who probably saw as much of the Tsaritsa during these years as anyone outside of the royal family has ever seen, relates this anecdote, which I repeat with particular gladness, because it is one of the few of the kind that I have heard concerning Her Majesty. This story was told me by the Empress herself, says Miss Eager. One morning there arrived on the train from the Caucasus a little girl aged 11. She approached a station porter and asked to be sent to the Minister of Education. The porter was greatly astonished and hesitated as to what he should do. Then the child said with oldish solemnity, "I have come from the Caucasus, a 7 days' journey, to be put to school. You must please get me a droshky and send me to his house." So the porter called a carriage and directed that she be driven to the Ministry of Education. Arriving there, she had great difficulty in gaining admission to the minister, but the doorman finally consented to tell the minister that a little girl from the Caucasus desired to see him. The minister was occupied at the moment with a secretary of the Empress, but the latter was interested in the message, and the child was ushered into the office. The little girl bowed to the two dignitaries and proceeded to relate her case. The minister appeared greatly amused, and told the child she must return to her home, as he had no vacancy. But the little girl was persistent, and soon showed that she had no idea of returning so easily to her distant home across the empire. "You are Minister of Education," she exclaimed, "and I have come all the way from the Caucasus to St. Petersburg to be put to school. You must put me somewhere." The minister, though puzzled, was beginning to be impressed. At last the Empress's secretary begged that the child be cared for until there was a vacancy in one of the schools patronized by the Tsaritsa. These schools are few in number and are very exclusive. A note was thereupon written by the minister to the mistress of one of these schools, and the little girl was sent to her under escort of a footman. The joy of the child was unbounded, and she could scarcely express her attitude to the minister. The secretary went that afternoon to Peterhof and related the incident to the Tsaritsa herself. The Empress asked that an inquiry be made immediately, and the truth of the child's story substantiated. The investigation showed that the two older sisters of the child had been admitted to a local school, but there was no room for her. She took this greatly to heart and fretted over it until at last she determined to get a schooling anyway. She appealed to friends, to the local priest and the doctor, and all of their combined efforts to reconcile her to the will of God proved futile. At last, to pacify her, they subscribed enough money for a ticket to the capital, and the child set forth on her long journey all alone. When the Empress heard the story in detail, her heart was touched, and she commanded that place be made for her in one of her own schools. The child is there today, receiving careful instruction, and enjoying the direct patronage of the Empress. The Empress really loves all children, and in spite of the coolness which exists between her and her court, all children are fond of her. On the name day of each of her own children, she takes a long drive with the child whose celebration it is, and this event is much looked forward to by them all. Whatever leniency may be exercised in correcting the capricious whims of Alexis, I believe that she is a strict mother with all of her children. The Empress has few recreations. Owing to the fact that she rides badly, she practically never rides for pleasure. Because of her disposition, she has few, if any, real confidants and intimate friends among the ladies of the court. She has ladies in waiting, several hundred of them, but these are chiefly for formal occasions, and of her own choice she has but one near her at a time, and different ladies are chosen for brief periods. Evenings she and the Emperor choose to retire to their private apartments, and if she has no guests she reads aloud to him, not infrequently from English newspapers or an English novel. The Tsar is fond of cards. The game of Wint, a gambling game, much played all over Russia, is a favorite of his, and he usually plays for high stakes, much enjoying the zest that the gambling element lends to the game. The Tsaritsa, on the other hand, is fond of the camera and enjoys photography immensely. The children have few playmates apart from their own family, and sometimes royal cousins, children of one or another of the Grand Dukes or of the royal relatives of their own mother or father abroad. The Princess Ella, daughter of the present Grand Duke of Hesse, and brother to the Tsaritsa, was a playmate whom the little Russian Grand Duchesses adored up to the sad and untimely death of the German princess. Being left most of the time to themselves, the children of the Tsar and Tsaritsa enjoy joining their mother in her pastimes when it is possible, and photography is one of the things that they can all do together. The Emperor has always done some shooting each year and is really fond of the sport. One morning, a few summers ago, he returned to the palace quite fatigued, having been out all night after blackcock. Blackcock shooting is considered right good sport because the birds are so shy that it is difficult to get near them, and indeed it is only at certain times of the year that they can be shot at all. On the morning that I refer to, the Empress greeted the royal sportsmen, and turning to a friend said blackcock can only be shot at the mating season, when the males are pouring forth their song in deaf and blind rapture. Could anything be more cruel than to kill them at such a time? In the summer the Tsaritsa is fond of sailing in and out among the Finnish wherries, but this annual outing is for 2 or 3 weeks only. Previous to Bloody Sunday, in January 1905, the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg was occupied, but since that fateful day the 2 outlying palaces only have been used. This has been a disappointment to Grand Duchess Olga, who always loved the Winter Palace and often expresses the wish to live there all the time. The Winter Palace is the largest building in Europe, and is a marvel in appointments. It contains rarest malachites and jaspers, rich paintings, gifts galore that have been showered upon other czars, priceless jewels, and wonderful carved furniture. Besides the great rooms of state, salons and banquet rooms, suites of residence, libraries, offices, and vast halls that are now used as public museums, are beautiful winter gardens, great conservatories rich in tropical plants, rare ferns and orchids, blossoming plants exuding fragrance, and among the forest of greenery hang many cages of singing birds. In the center of these winter gardens are pools of water in which goldfish sport, and at times pretty fountains play into these pools. Whenever I have been in this wonderful palace, I have felt as if I were wandering through a dream world. Several times I have been through portions of this palace, and each time I have felt a new thrill of unreality. The occasion of my first visit was when the Tsar received the members of the First Duma, the occasion when I first saw the Tsaritsa, the Dowager Empress, and the little Grand Duchesses. The Tsar had commanded all of the great dames of the court to appear in full court costume, and the result was a scene of unparalleled splendor, a spectacle imposing beyond imagination. The throne room and halls that were in use that day suggested scenes from the magnificent days of the Empire of France, when beautiful women and emblazoned uniformed men arrayed themselves in costumes of glittering splendor. The old Russian court costumes which were worn in the Winter Palace that day were quite as splendid as any of the French ever conceived, even in the days of greatest pomp and show. On another occasion I was received at the Winter Palace by a well-known and powerful nobleman of the court, who has been close to the Empress for many years in the dual capacity of high functionary and friend. He is one to whom many high thanks are due for some of the material contained in these articles, for he not only told me some of the anecdotes which are here related, but he verified much of the material that I had collected from other persons and sources. Peterhof is the favorite residence of the Tsaritsa, and 4 of her 5 children were born there. One of the several buildings of this palace boasts a charming romantic history. About half a century ago, when the first Nicholas was soon to be Emperor of Russia, he paid a visit to the German court. During the visit a tournament was held, and Nicholas, then a Grand Duke, acquitted himself with honor. At the close of the tournament the victors rode past and close under a balcony, where were seated the ladies of the court and the royal family. A young Prussian princess tossed a wreath of roses, which the Russian Grand Duke caught on his sword. The incident proved the beginning of an attachment which culminated in their marriage. Some years after, when the Grand Duke had become emperor, he bought the great park of Peterhof and built a palace for his empress. Remembering the incident of the wreath of roses at the tournament at the Prussian court, the device of a sword and a wreath of roses was made the predominant decorative figure of the palace. You may see it there today. Now as then, Peterhof belongs to the ruling empress. Zashko Selo is an imperial residence belonging to the government. Both of these palaces are within an hour of St. Petersburg. Any visitor may stroll through the outer gardens and adjoining parks of the palaces, and at any time one may meet the Tsaritsa or the Grand Duchesses driving or riding. The Tsar is the only real prisoner of the family, although Alexis, the 4-year-old heir, is jealously guarded. The Tsaritsa rides badly, despite the fact that she is commander and honorary colonel of at least 2 cavalry regiments. She does not sit a horse well and never rides for pleasure. In this respect she is very unlike many modern queens, notably the Empress Elizabeth of Austria, who is a marvelous horsewoman, possessing that rare hypnotic influence over the most spirited horses that the animals themselves are quick to recognize and yield to. It is only on such occasions as a review of one of her own regiments that the Tsaritsa mounts a horse. Ordinarily she drives, in summer in an open carriage, and generally unescorted. The children may from time to time be seen playing about the lawns with a favorite pony, or driving in little wicker-work carts. They are as full of frolic as any little girl in America, and in the nursery and the household apartments of the palaces they are as ingenuous, as irrepressible, and often quite as embarrassing as any children we all know. Royal manners, at least in the children, are no different from manners of other people, and the daughters of even an emperor and empress have sometimes to be rebuked quite as severely as any children the world over. The Tsaritsa dresses very plainly, richly often, but in general effects simple. The court has never approved her clothes, chiefly, I think, because of her inability to wear good clothes well. As a child she dressed in the utmost simplicity, and the habit has remained with her. At certain court functions etiquette prescribes her costume. When she dons court dress known as Old Russian, she has merely to wear elaborate clothes that have been described in detail for her generations ago. It is when she dons costumes for everyday wear that she fails to please a fastidious court. The average American girl very naturally thinks of the clothes of the Tsaritsa of Russia with a combined feeling of awe and interest, with just a little of envy creeping in. Imagine having all the money you want to spend on your clothes, and being able to wear jewels valued at millions of dollars. And of course the American girl wants to know all the details of the Tsaritsa's wardrobe, and how many hats and dresses she has each season, and how much they cost. It may be a disappointing fact, but it is nevertheless true that the Tsaritsa just hates the thought of clothes, and though her costumes are of expensive fabrics, they never have any chic individuality of their own, for the very good reason that she cares so little about them. Of course she does her shopping in Paris, but she does it by proxy. One of the ladies in waiting is commissioned to buy each season her gowns and her hats and all the other little details appropriate for a Tsaritsa's wardrobe, in Paris, but many times when they reach the Tsaritsa she discards them with the expression, "Indeed, that is perfectly lovely and very Frenchy, but it would never do for me at all." The corsetière in Paris who makes the Tsaritsa's stays has trouble of her own, for the Tsaritsa utterly refuses to change her figure to suit the ever-changing modes. Her waist is growing large of late, according to the Parisian idea of a fashionable figure, but this doesn't trouble the Tsaritsa as much as it would trouble many women in America. For everyday wear her gowns are all of the plainest, but of course there are occasions when she must wear regal robes. Her court costume is a magnificent creation of the richest satin, elaborately trimmed with heavy embroidery. Masses of the embroidery are used, while the corsage is laden with jeweled trimmings. The buttons which trim this court costume are each one of them worth a small fortune. They consist of a large pearl in a wonderfully artistic setting. The Tsaritsa's pearls, which she wears with her court costume, are famous the world over. It is no wonder that she has all of these magnificent things, For in addition to the hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of gifts that she has herself received from her subjects and from fabulously rich kings, princes, and potentates of the East and Central Asia, she has at her disposal jewels that belong to the Russian crown, gifts to other empresses and emperors, far back, perhaps for several hundred years. Sometimes she wears drop earrings of matched pearls, which are marvelously valuable, and her dog collar and necklace and corsage pin, also of pearls, have a value of millions of dollars. The Tsaritsa is always glad when the time comes for her to take off her court costume. The long, heavy train is a burden to her. She is very partial to light-in-weight gowns. Many of her dresses are of the lingerie order, consisting of lace and fine nainsook. Yet, on the other hand, she has many house gowns and cloaks of velvet, trimmed with rare laces. Perhaps of all her jewels she cares most for a long string of wonderful pearls, which she wears very often. The string is so long that she can wear it twice around her neck, and yet have the longest loop reach to her knees. The short loop comes to the waistline, and is finished with one single pear-shaped pearl of enormous value. All of the children's clothes are made according to the Tsaritsa's idea, and simplicity is their keynote. The children are very apt to wear white entirely, and the 4 little girls are dressed exactly alike. Their hair is arranged in the same way, too, brushed straight back from their foreheads. Of course, the finest of materials is used in making their clothes, but the design is always extremely simple. Their christening costumes were all made alike, even the small boys this time. They were of the sheerest of white mull, with exquisitely fine lace insertions. The little dresses had short sleeves and were cut out round at the neck and tied on the shoulders with white ribbon, having long silk fringe. The shoulder bows were the dress-up touch, the touch which is so seldom seen in any of the costumes worn by the Tsaritsa's children. The young man of the family is also usually dressed in white, and though his little Russian suits come from Paris, they are strictly plain in design, generally of heavy white linen, and trimmed with bands of embroidery. All these little details may be commonplace, but they are perhaps all important when we are trying to analyze the character of the Tsaritsa through her tastes. End of section 18.